So hello and welcome everyone. Good afternoon from Belém. My name is Thomas. I'm from the German Institute for Development Evaluation, and we are very excited to welcome Annika Stechemesser today on this first day of the Evidence for Climate Action event series. Annika is a researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and the MacArthur Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. Her work focuses mainly on the empirical evaluation of climate policies, and for that she uses modern econometric approaches and machine learning. Her presentation in just a minute is on what works evaluating climate policy measures over 2 decades, and she presents work that's co-authored with authors from PIC, the OECD, the University of Victoria, the University of Oxford, and TU Berlin. So here at COP, hot topics do include the latest round of NDCs and debating on how to close the remaining emission gaps. And the evidence she will present today really speaks directly to this question because it answers which concrete policy packages have actually cut emissions at scale in the real world over the last 20 years. I personally find this paper groundbreaking, specifically for 3 reasons. So first of all, the data. The authors really use a comprehensive global data set, 1,500 policy adoptions over 2 decades, more than 40 countries on six continents. So this is really representative evidence. Second, the approach. I think the approach is very innovative because most studies, they do start with the question, did this policy reduce emission? But this paper really flips the approach and rather asks, or first looks where emissions clearly drop and then asks what policies were in place when this happened. So for COP30, this result really speaks directly to the questions, where have countries actually bent the curve and what did they do differently? And third and last, the paper focuses on policy mixes. And so in that regard, I think it's really near to policymaking because it's a more realistic approach looking at mixes of policies rather than individual policies alone. So if you have questions during the presentation, please ask them in the chat. Please change the settings so you address everyone in the small blue button. And then without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Annika. Thanks for being with us today.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And in the next 15 or so minutes, we want to talk about what works evaluating climate policy measures over 2 decades. I like to start my talks with this graph, which is my favorite graph illustrating climate change. It shows the temperature development on planet Earth over the last 20,000 years. And what we see here is that we came out of the last ice age, and then here we entered the Holocene, which is the time period of Earth where humans came about. And we've seen that we entered like a long sort of stable period with very little temperature variation. And then this happened in the last around 100 years. And this was 1.2 degrees, now it's even higher. So we can here really see how fast this temperature change is in comparison to what our planet is used to. And this illustrates to me very nicely what problem we're actually causing. So the global average temperature is already higher than ever before in the history of human civilization. We can say that we're catapulting ourselves out of the current geological age into the Anthropocene, the one that is created by humans. And this is still the previous emissions gap report, which named an emissions gap of 28 to 42% to maintain a 2-degree target. So what should we do about it? And one way to address this issue is through policy. And what we actually do is that we have an increase in climate policy over the last 2 decades. So this data is between 1998 and 2022 for 4 key sectors that are high emitting. So we have the building sector, the electricity sector, industry sector, and transport sector. And this just visualizes how many relevant policy adoptions and policy tightenings we have here per country. And This comes from this novel data set by the OECD, which we were fortunate to use in the study that covers around 30,000 climate policies in 51 countries that cover 80% of global emissions. And we see that the number of climate policy measures has grown steadily over the last 2 decades, actually. And if we have a look at the type of different instruments that are employed, we see like a whole range of different approaches that are taken, which also differ between developed and developing economies. Developed economies are like shaded in the darker color, developing and transitioning economies in the lighter color. And here you can just see how often this particular type of policy has been adopted. And don't worry, you don't need to look at all the details, but what this illustrates is that we actually have a lot of different things that are used. But what we don't have is a systematic evaluation of all of these measures, because it was just methodologically impossible to look at all of these different cases and analyze each and every one. So this leaves us actually not only with an ambitions gap that is often talked about in climate policy, but also with a knowledge gap where we're not actually really sure which approach is going to help us to reduce emissions like in a substantial way. So we explicitly look at large emission reductions. So what we have done is we have addressed this question in a study that was published in Science last August, and August 2024. Yes, it's already winter again. And here we look at climate policies that achieve major emission reductions, and I just want to walk you a little bit through how we approached this. So usually when evaluating climate policy, we ask forward-looking causal questions. So we want to know, does X have an effect on Y? Has this policy measure led to a reduction in emissions? But what we've done with our econometric setup, we asked, what caused Y? So we look at CO2 emissions in a particular sector and country, and then we find years when these emissions substantially decrease in a model that controls for other covariates in relation to a control group. And then once we have found all these breaks, we call them breaks in emissions, we can then estimate the effect of the policy. So how does this work? So we have the emissions data from the 4 sectors. The emissions cover 20 years. And then for each sector, we split into 2 country groups for a better homogeneity. So we look at developed economies and developing economies separately. And then we use the machine learning approach to agnostically detect breaks in the emissions. So we basically find places where the emissions changed more than we'd expect them to. And once we've done that, we can use basically some traditional econometrics to estimate the effect size, so like a difference method. And in the last step, we then attribute the climate policy data. So we say all of these policies may have contributed to this break in emissions. And what we can then do, because we have like a larger number of these instances, is we can take all the success cases and do some like descriptive statistics on them. So we can say something like, how often was this policy successful and in which countries, and which other combinations, which other policies was it combined with, and they were successful in combination. So this is what the analysis setup looks like. Let's have a look at some results. Here we have another slightly overwhelming graph, but I'm going to walk you through it. So every sector has a color, and then you have these little cubes, and these little cubes basically tell you how many large emission reductions did we find in that country, in that sector. And overall, we have 69 emission breaks in 41 countries. We find most of them in the building sector and least in the electricity sector. And overall, we find 48 for developed economies and 21 for developing economies. And given that we have more developed than developing economies, they're actually overrepresented. Exactly. So as an example, we can here see that, say, in, I don't know, the UK, we found 1 large emission reduction in the electricity sector. Okay, so this just to give you a bit of an overview. So in some countries, we didn't find anything at all. In some countries, we found a few of them. And then what we can do now is for each and every single country, we can look at each and every one of these little cubes and go into the details. And what that can look like, I've just brought a few examples. So one example here is the United Kingdom in the electricity sector. And here we have the black line, which is the actual observed emissions. And the blue line is what our model is doing. And these red little vertical lines here are the breaks in emissions. And this is what we would have expected the emissions to look like. So they're lower. And here we can see these little cubes which all correspond to different policies. And all the policies in this like gray area are the ones where we'd say they have contributed. And this was quite an interesting case because this says a very, like in this time, there was a very like well-studied policy applied, the UK carbon price floor. What we actually see here is that there was a whole number of policies launched together, which are usually not considered together, but one policy is isolated. A second example is Sweden in the building sector, and there we have our break here, our emission reduction here, and we have 3 policies that match this emission reduction, which is a combination of a carbon tax and adoption subsidies. And specifically here, we have a mix of CO2 pricing and subsidy programs for refurbishment and heating replacements that came together. Right, so here is the promised overview, which is another fairly complicated graph, but I'm just going to tell you what the main takeaway message is. What we basically compare here is if a policy has been matched to a large emission reduction by itself, how effective was it? And if it was matched to a policy but part of a policy mix, how effective is it? And that is these sort of like little 2 sides here, in a mix and by itself. And what we do see here is that almost all policy measures are more successful in the policy mix. And the other interesting thing that we found was that price instruments also achieve good results on their own. And you can see that, for example, here we have taxation, where the sort of right column, which is the like by itself one, is equally high or even higher. And we also see that here. We see that for driving as well. And we see that for building. So this is something we observed across all the sectors. And then we went ahead and looked at if we have a mix and it has a price instrument in it, how does it perform in comparison to the average mix, say? And that is these little black bars. And here we see that lots of mixes. So if it's like all the way at the end of the thing, it means that all mixes were only ever successful that had this policy if they also had a price policy. So we do see that pricing instruments stick out for us in their effectiveness. What we then went ahead to do is to basically aggregate all the policies on like a higher level. So we're now looking only at 4 categories, which are pricing, regulation, subsidy, and information policies. And then we wanted to see if there's any differences to how they combine across sectors and levels of development. So we make this little like pie chart, and what they tell us basically is if we have all the successful policies in the building sector in, say, developed economies, then we had 27.3% that only had a subsidy policy assigned to them. But 18.2% were a combination of subsidy and pricing, and another 18.2% were pricing, regulation, subsidy altogether. And this is sort of how we then get a bit of a picture. So this kind of illustrates what we're doing here. And we do see like differences according to the sectors and differences according to the level of development. So for example, here pricing was only detected as a successful intervention in isolation, which is very different to the developed economies. We also see a much bigger role of regulation and information policy. Yeah, so here we see the other sectors. We also see that like a sector with lots of private consumers, like for example, transport in developed economies has a great potential for complementarities. And what we learned from this is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and you have to, as a policymaker, take into account both the sector you're targeting and the level of development of the economies you're working with. Right, so here's my take-home message for you after this short and spicy input of these results. So what have we done? We've done a systematic analysis of effective policy measures most of which have rarely been studied or never been studied so far. We found 63 success cases from 2 decades, and we find that large reductions in emissions are predominantly associated with policy mixes. The most effective mix depends on the sector and the level of economic development. And we see that price-based instruments have a special role in developed economies. They are particularly common in efficient mixes and also led to large emission reductions as a single measure. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this concise presentation, surely highly relevant for COP30 and policymakers. So please, everyone, if you do have questions, do post them in the chat. In the meantime, I could act as a discussion opener. So let's say I'm interested in a specific policy or a specific country. Say I want to learn more about pricing instruments in a given world region, for instance. So how would I go about? So how can I be as specific as possible, drawing on your work to answer my concrete questions as a policymaker, for instance, or a researcher maybe also?
Yeah, so of course all the results are in the study, but the study may be like a little bit, we didn't have very much space. So we actually made like a web tool that allows you to access all the details of this work. And maybe I can like briefly demo it actually. So it's called can you see my share?
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so it's basically this website, which is like totally easy to find. You just have to search for pick Climate Policy Explorer. And it does 2 things. So you can either select a policy intervention type. So say we're interested in pricing policies in some sectors. So say we like to learn about transport. And then we can like explore this specific sector, and it gives us like a lot of information. So it tells us basically the share of like how often were pricing policies like successful in the sector in comparison to the other policy types, in which sectors was pricing successful in general. You also get like a really handy list that gives you an overview of all the countries where it has been matched and whether it was a standalone or policy mix, which is like really nice to get a first overview. And you also get a number of like statistics, facts on the individual policy instruments that have been applied, and you can also kind of like get a bit more detail and learn about it. So this you can do for every single sector and every single like larger policy type. But then also, if you're more interested on the country level, you can also dive into a specific country. So say I'm interested in China, and then here it shows me basically how many cases do we have for the country. And so we have one in buildings and one in industry. So say I'm interested in industry, and then it gives me this like nice interactive graph where I can like see the model results, I can see the counterfactual, and then here I can sort of check out which policies there were. I can get an overview, and you can actually also download this data to have the data for the specific country and then visualize it yourself, or you can download like the figure and use it for your work. Yeah, so all the details are in this tool. Yeah, and I hope it will be useful to people.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's absolutely impressive. Okay, so Alexandre, Henri already found the link and posted it in the chat. So everyone who's interested, please feel free to use that link and do investigate the results in details. That's surely impressive. Okay, so we have one question from the audience, and the first is about case studies. So did you check your results, and did you track whether the results of your studies are in line with case studies? So for instance, case studies of specific interventions in a specific countries. that you find have strong mitigation effects? Have you looked at case studies to verify that results for these cases?
Yeah. So for the cases that the success case that we found where we did have other case studies that like looked at the same time period and intervention basically that we matched, we did actually find quite a good match. So for example, for the UK, we have the carbon price floor policy, which I just mentioned, and our results agree with studies published on this. Then actually also this break in China, here this financing mechanism, this is also fairly well studied, and that also agreed with the literature. So we have like a few cases that give us confidence that our results like match with the mainstream literature. But a lot of cases don't have mainstream literature, so these ones, we sort of put this out there now. And actually, I hope and I'm sure that some other teams will follow up with case studies on some of these specific cases to kind of consolidate more evidence for this, which is both on this like kind of bird's eye perspective that we've taken the study, but then also complemented with like the detailed case study approach. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The second question from the chat is about the choice of sectors that are available in your study or that you did study. So how were they chosen? So was available evidence a factor? And specifically, the question is on the agriculture sector, which does not seem to be included. It might be a subsector in some other sector that you've looked at, but that seems to be specifically relevant for developing countries.
Yeah, I 100% agree. So the sectors were basically chosen based on the availability of the policy data. And so we have like the emissions data is available for more sectors, but we did not have more policy data. And this is kind of what this analysis critically hinged on. And agriculture is in fact not a subset of industry at all. Like it would be way too important. So we're hoping to do a follow-up looking at agriculture in the future. And not only in agriculture, but especially in the context of developing economies, because as you have sort of seen briefly on this map overview, while we do cover 82% of emissions, there's still like, we have like one country on the African continent covered, and that was due to data restrictions. So we're very much hoping that we can kind of in the future address this better, both in terms of the like expansion of sectors, but also the expansion of countries. And that's definitely like future work. Yeah. And that would be like really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I mean, but based on your study, if I may come in here, how would I go about identifying something like heterogeneous treatment effects? So how would I go about adapting the results from your studies and learning from policies that have proven to be effective to adapt them in a low income setting? So what would be the best approach to transfer the knowledge you have on average, or maybe for country groups, to a specific case? Do you have any guidance on that?
So I think the best like current idea would be to find a country that's as similar as you can to your own country and look what was successful there. So for example, this example I shared from Sweden in the industry sector, in the building sector, that could also be relevant for other European countries. And similarly, it can work for developing economies. We did try to like make these distinctions because we are super convinced that the policy approaches are not the same. And we do also see that different types of instruments are more common. So like, for example, these price instruments are just not as often like implemented in developing economies for various reasons. And we can't like say, oh, whatever worked in this country will also work in a developing economy. So it makes sense to look at a country that's most similar to your own and see what worked there for now. And then we're also hoping to sort of dig a little bit deeper into topics like policy sequencing. So to what extent does the order in which you like launch policy make a difference to the eventual success and the eventual large emission reduction. And this is also something we're kind of still working on the methodological side to bring this forward. But I think we're going to see something there in the next years, like in general in the community, how to better evaluate policy sequencing questions in this context. Yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you for that answer. So that's certainly certainly important and an inspiring outlook. Okay, there's one more question in the chat that is about sustainability. So the question is, what you looked at primarily, as far as I understand, is whether a policy approach is effective in leading to a structural break in emissions. But have you also looked at sustainability? So whether a specific policy mix is sustainable in the sense that it's very difficult to reverse?
Yeah. We actually haven't. So far, the impact on CO2 emissions is the only outcome metric we considered. But there's obviously like a lot of other aspects that matter to policymaking. And that might be something like sustainability. It might be also things like public acceptance or cost effectiveness. And in the end, for actual policymakers to make a decision, all of these things will come into interplay. The question is like, how can we like frame that in an empirical design? And that's a kind of challenging. And we have like quite a few more data constraints, but it's definitely an interesting thing to think about. And sustainability, as in how hard is it to reverse, has actually not really crossed my mind on how we would do that so far. But I'm going to take this away as food for thought, as an important aspect to consider when we look at which different evaluation metrics we might want to look at in the future, aside from emission reductions. Yeah, so thanks very much. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions in the chat. And since we have a very dense program at E4CA, go to the program page and check out the next events in the schedule and take part. And for today, I would very much like to thank you, Annika, for presenting this highly relevant and very highly published research on a question that is definitely relevant for this climate conference. And we will follow your work. So thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Have a good time at COP. Bye.
Bye-bye.